Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Discussions with Dr. D. My name is David Detomasi. I'm a professor of international business at the Smith School of Business at Queen's University. I teach courses on strategy, geopolitics, and of global competition, and I do it undergrads, MBAs, and executive ed. Today, we're very lucky. We have as our guest someone I've been talking to for a number of years now, but I've finally got a chance to talk to him in detail about economic issues facing Canada, Dr. Christopher Ragan, who sent me an extensive biography that's going to be posted in the show notes. I won't go through all of it, but I'll go through some of the major points. Just in the interest of time, Dr. Ragan did a bachelor's in economics from the University of Victoria, graduated in 1984, and a master's from Queen's in 1985. All right, that's good to know. And a PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Economics, graduating in 1989. For the last number of years, through August of 24, just 2017 to August 24, he was the director of the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University. Before that, there's an extensive list of things he has done. He was chair of the Canada's Fiscal Commission between 2014 and 2019. He held the David Dodge Chair in Monetary Policy at the C.D. Howe Institute from 2010 to 2013. And he has served as a special advisor to the Governor of the Bank of Canada. In addition to that, he's an extensive list of academic and public writings, some of them entitled Is the Debt War Over? A Canadian Priorities Agenda. And he's had an extensive career as a public commentator on Canadian economic issues, ranging from his best-selling textbook in economics to frequent op-eds in all the major news outlets in the country and internationally, including the Globe and Mail and several others. So I can't think of anyone off the top of my head more equipped to discuss the current state and future prospects of Canada's economy. So, Christopher, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, David. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, great. Now, there's a number of issues that I think we need to explore that worry Canadians and have been bothering us for a long, long time. One of the ones is there's a public narrative out there that Canada, we're not doing as well as we used to be economically. We seem to be falling behind in everything from wages to living standards and all kinds of things. Now, I know there's a lot of public commentary on that. How real is that, and where did it come from? And then we'll talk later about what we can do about it.
So I think it is real. You say that a lot of Canadians think about this. I guess my concern is that I think not enough Canadians think about this. And what I like to say, with apologies to the Scotiabank advertising group, is, Canadians are poorer than they think. We still are a rich country, and we are richer than many countries, but we are not as rich as we used to be relative to other countries. And in fact, in absolute terms, it has been getting worse. Not better slowly, but actually worse in recent years. So to me, this all starts with the concept of GDP per capita. Now, there are many things that we care about in our life, but surely one of the things, maybe even one of the top things, is, what does the average person have as a command over resources? And the single best, most comprehensive measure of that is GDP per capita. So you take total GDP, which is the value of goods and services produced in the country, you divide it by the number of people in the country, and you get GDP per capita. Last year, that number was 73,200. Okay? So that's a good number to keep in mind, 73,200. So where does that go? Well, about 50% of it goes on average to after-tax workers' income. 35% goes to a collection of governments, and about 15% of it goes to profits. So we should all think about, it doesn't matter who you are, whether you are running an NGO or whether you're an entrepreneur or whether you're a finance minister or something else. It seems to me that you should care about GDP per capita because, obviously we should care about what our after-tax income is, but we should also care about how well-resourced our governments are, who are then providing public goods to all of us. We should also care about how well our firms are doing because many of us, in fact, an increasing number over time, are shareholders of small or medium or large-size firms. So everybody should care about GDP per capita. Now, for many years, I'm 62, David. I must be roughly the same age as you. For the first 50 years of my life, GDP per capita in Canada was about 80% of that in the United States. Okay. Now, one thing I should hasten to say is that GDP per capita doesn't tell us anything about how income is distributed across, higher income, medium income, lower income people. And so that's another discussion. But it's a pretty good measure of the average. And so we've been at about 80% of the US level for the first 50 years of my life. For the last 10 or 12 years of my life, that number has gone down to about 70% of the US value. Okay. So the gap between Canada and the US has been opening up. Now, some people say, well, let's not compare ourselves against the US. Let's compare ourselves against other countries. But the problem is we don't do so well on that either. So I'm just going to give you some numbers here. We are lower than, in GDP per capita terms, we are lower than 14 other, what we call or think of as rich countries. We're 25% poorer by this metric than Denmark and the Netherlands. We're 20% below Iceland. We're 12% below Germany and Sweden. We're 10% below Australia. So we are not made worse off by the fact that other countries are richer than we are. But it seems to me that when we are falling behind them and an increasing number of other countries, we ought to be asking ourselves, what are we doing, wrong? What are they doing right? What are they doing that we might be able to do in this country? Now, not everything that works in Denmark is going to work in Sweden. We have different countries, different political systems, etc. But when there are these gaps that are this large and this persistent, we ought to be thinking about, what we can do and what ideas we can take from elsewhere. And as I said, and this will be my last thought on this idea, that GDP per capita has not only been growing more slowly than it has in the past, but in the last 2 years, maybe 2.5, it's actually been falling in absolute terms in Canada. Okay. So you can talk about, is it that GDP has slowed down, or has the population been rising quickly? So the denominator is actually taking down the ratio. Well, both of those things have been happening, right? GDP has been growing more slowly, and until very, very recently, population has been growing quickly in the last few years. So GDP per capita has actually been falling. And I'm not talking about during COVID. During COVID, it clearly did. And during crises, that's pretty standard. But post-COVID, GDP per capita has actually been falling. So this is a very important issue in my view. And back to my opening idea, it's very important no matter who you are in this country, whether you believe in a bigger role for government. Well, government gets its resources by taxing GDP per capita. So whether you believe in bigger government or smaller government or a different color of government, or whether you're an entrepreneur or running a charity, GDP per capita matters, and it matters hugely. And we're just not doing very well.
And this isn't a new phenomenon. I remember getting quotes from individual finance ministers in the early 2000s warning about this magical thing called productivity.
Yep.
And, that it's not only an absolute factor right now that we're not doing as well. We are been declining in a relative scale a little bit, but over time. And I don't think people, it's sort of like compound interest. If you don't keep up, the people who are doing better than you get better faster, sort of thing. So this is a long-standing issue. So why is it that Canadians have been unable to address it, or at least recognize it and do something about it earlier?
Okay, so you used the word productivity. I haven't used it yet, but I'll jump into productivity. So if you just look at the very simple arithmetic about GDP per capita, there's only two ways to increase GDP per capita in an arithmetic sense. One is that you get more hours worked per person. And the other is that you get more output produced per hour of work. Mm-hmm. Now, the first thing Canadians actually do quite well at. The first thing is about the nation's employment rate. To what extent are we successful as a country in getting our labor resources working? And the answer is actually we do quite well at that. We have a high employment rate. We generally have a low unemployment rate. We actually have a lot of hours worked per person. So, and in fact, not everybody wants to work more, right? You and I might be happier to work fewer hours, right? If we could, especially if we could actually earn more per hour, we'd probably work fewer hours. So the first thing we do quite well at as a country. The second thing, which is GDP per hour worked, that is productivity. Okay.
Yeah.
And that we don't do very well at. And productivity typically is one of those things that grows. It's a very boring macro variable. It grows at 1.2% per year, or it slows down to 0.9% per year, or it slows down even more to 0.7%, 0.7 of a percentage point per year. Our productivity has been growing very slowly. And so then you ask the question, well, how could we raise our productivity either in its level or its growth rate, or both? And that is what gets into the big issue. So every country, I suspect, every government in every country for a long time has been looking for ways to raise productivity. And first of all, there's no single kind of magic bullet solution here. Does education help? Yes. Does on-the-job training help? Yes. Does daycare help so that you can get more women in the workforce, or even just more of every couple into the workforce? Yes. Does more capital equipment help? Yes. And this is one of the things that most economists come back to when they're looking at the underlying sources of our low productivity growth, is that if you have more capital equipment per worker and better capital equipment per worker, you tend to have better productivity. And Canada has low capital, equipment per worker. So this then gets you to, well, why aren't we having the private sector do more investment in, factories and plants and equipment and better equipment, which embeds those new technologies. And so this, I think, is the big thing that, and we've been talking for quite some time about the need for Canadian businesses to do more investment. Well, so that then opens up a whole discussion. Well, why don't Canadian businesses do more investment? Well, is it that, the tax system is, too much of a penalty, or is it the regulatory system that provides or presents too many obstacles, or is it the threat of more tariffs from the United States and the uncertainty created by that? And I think the answer is that all of those things are true. And, just to connect this with our current policy discussion with our new government and a new prime minister, I think the new prime minister is really trying to increase the attractiveness of Canada as a place to invest. Bill C5 is about trying to reduce regulatory and other obstacles so that we can do more investment in big projects that will improve productivity and productivity growth. So this is a big, big lift. It is, as you said, it is not a new problem. It's an old problem that seems to be getting even worse. And we, I think, need to do something about it. I think our prime minister clearly takes that view.
Well, yeah, I think one of the economic ways Mr. Carney is differentiating himself from his predecessor is he sees these issues quite clearly. One of the things that I read a speech from, I think, Carolyn Rogers, one of its deputy investment, it says that one of the problems, you mentioned a number of them, is competition. We don't have enough of it. One of the places where I kind of think, I'm just thought about this during the podcast, is the banking sector. We have a very solid, stable, clear-minded banking sector, but not particularly one that I think it takes a lot of risk, or encourages these sorts. So competition and risk taking. Can you make some comments? Are those things that we need to look at?
So I think competition is something that for way too long we haven't been worrying enough about in Canada. I think this is also a problem in some other countries as well. In the United States, there is a growing recognition that there's growing corporate concentration is typically the term that's used. So what that means is you've got firms with increasing amounts of market power. You've got more and more industries with smaller numbers of bigger firms. And so the kind of standard economics 101 predicted response in that world is that you get not only higher prices and probably lower quality service to customers, which of course feeds into the cost of living issue that you started with, okay? But it also means that there's less reason for firms to innovate. Like in a highly competitive environment, firms innovate because they want to reap the benefits of that innovation. They want to beat their competitors by being more innovative. Well, if you have fewer competitors and you've got a tight little oligopoly like the Canadian banking sector or like the Canadian telecom sector or the airline sector, and there are more, but you've got tight little oligopolies, there's not a huge need for innovation because you've got this system where you can rely on high prices. You've got a protected market. Maybe it's because of policies that lead to that protection, and we can get into that. But I think competition is something that we are now talking about much more than we were even 5 years ago. And in fact, you've seen the Canadian competition policy has been changed. They have changed. They have sort of tightened the conditions under which Canadian firms can merge. They have removed what is called the efficiencies defense, which we can talk about if you like. They've required competition policy to look more at input markets, not just output markets. So I actually think now, for the first time in several years, the Canadian government, through the Competition Bureau, has got kind of a new lease on life. Now, whether they are able to, really enforce those new rules is, it's too early to tell. But I think we're very much at the beginning of this. So I think this is one of several problems that is feeding into the productivity malaise.
Well, another problem that I've seen and looked at the statistics are things like new business venture creation is low. The classic criticism of Canada is that we muddle through. We got it pretty good. We don't need. Now, I'm kind of wondering, with Mr. Trump pressure on us, will this be the spur that we need to recognize that we are in a global competitive environment now, and that we can't rely on, or we shouldn't rely so much on just sort of getting by? We need to be a little more aggressive, perhaps, in our approach to our economic future.
Yeah, look, as much as I dislike Donald Trump's style and his sense of the presidency and probably most of his policies, I think there are some silver linings in President Trump. And one of them is what you just mentioned. I think because of, it's not just because of President Trump's view on tariffs, but even his I don't know if it's a serious view, but he certainly opines on annexation and Canada becoming the 51st state and all that kind of crap. I think for the first time in a while, maybe for the first time in a very long while, Canadian policymakers, politicians are saying, wow, we got to get our house in order. We got to get our act together. And if we can't rely on the United States as a trading partner, then maybe we've got to rely on each other as trading partners. So now we're talking much more about interprovincial free trade. We should have been talking about this 100 years ago, 70 years ago, 50 years ago, 20 years ago. And we have talked about it, but we've never really done much about it. So again, Mark Carney clearly believes this as well, but will we really get there? Yeah. Well, it's one thing for the federal government to reduce its obstacles, but most of the obstacles, I think, to interprovincial free trade are coming from the provinces. And provinces and their premiers tend to be provincial in the worst sense of the word, right? And, kind of petty provincial potentates. And they need to take a more national view and a less protectionist view if we're really going to have significantly freer trade interprovincially. But it also, that same sort of concern leads to, okay, should we, as Canadian firms and exporters, should we be looking to export more to India or to Europe or to the UK or to, other countries and relying less on the United States? Look, I'm a big fan of, and I don't want us to move to a world where we no longer trade with the United States. I mean, the
Yeah.
United States is a huge market. There's obviously good reasons why Canada and the United States should be trading with each other to a large extent because of geography. Just look at a map. But I'm also in favor of doing more trade with anybody who wants to do trade.
Mhm.
So if we can actually break into export markets in India, Europe, the UK, Africa, just wherever people are, if we can sell our goods and services there, let's do it. And so now I think with the threats coming from the United States, there's just more pressure on that. I think there's going to be more pressure as well for us to maybe get our tax system in order. We haven't done a serious review of our tax system since the Mulroney government in the late 1980s. Well, tax systems get kind of polluted with all kinds of bells and whistles over time. And every once in a while, you've got a clean house. Well, I think that's long overdue. I think the same thing is true about our regulatory system. So I think that, a very important silver lining that comes with Donald Trump is that it may be a very, very important wake-up call for Canada to do a lot of things differently. I think the same is true, by the way, in terms of public spending on national defense. So many people could have a different view about how much Canada should spend on national defense. My own view, I don't know what the right number is, but my own view is that if we are going to be an integral member of a NATO alliance and the NATO countries agree on X%, if we're going to be a good standing partner in that alliance, we ought to be doing X%. And I don't know what the right number for X is. I leave that to the NATO countries and governments to do it. But if we're going to agree on 3% or 4% or 5%, then let's do it. Let's play our part and do our part and not be a laggard. And that clearly is happening now because of Donald Trump. So I think there's a lot of good, actually, that is coming from Donald Trump, despite the fact that I disagree with almost everything he says.
Well, yeah, he has lit a fire under us and other folks. My one of my concerns is, his time will come and it'll go, and I think there's some people thinking that we'll get a more reasonable next administration. Things will calm down. It'll kind of go back to the way it was, and all this impetus. We in politics, nothing can happen for a number of years, and then a decade happens in 3 months or 6 months. I'm kind of feeling that's where we are right now. And how do we keep that momentum going?
Well, look, I would love it if Donald Trump leaves office in 2028, assuming he does, or January of 2029. January 2029, is that right? Yeah. I would love it if he were succeeded by some approximately normal, U.S. politician. And that normal U.S. politician kind of undoes much of what Donald Trump has done. I'm not confident of that at all. He could be succeeded by J.D. Vance. He could be succeeded by somebody else. Donald Trump is a product of his times in the United States. And so we, I think, cannot simply assume that life will go back to normal in 2029. I think I'm not sure I agree with the full dramatic content of Mark Carney's statements that this age-old relationship is over and that the world is being completely transformed. I'm not sure that's right, but it might be right. And I do think we have to hedge our bets, I suppose. Yeah. And we have to really think seriously about a world where we may not be able to have the wide open trading relationship that we had once with the United States. I think that's very unfortunate, but I do think we have to think about that as a distinct possibility.
That's nothing new in the sense that protectionism in American political culture is not a new thing. In
Correct.
fact, there's a reason he got elected, whether we agree with it or not. He's tapping into some things that are very powerful part of the American system, and they're not going away. So it's something we need to think about. And one of the ways, obviously, is talking about increasing our GDP and GDP per capita and things we were just talking about. Now, moving on to a little bit of our next topic. You mentioned your age. You're 62. I'm 56. We had it good in some ways in terms of when we were of university age and shortly after, my wife and I were able to save money and
Yeah.
eventually purchase our own house. We were 26 or 27 when we did that, and we did it more or less by ourselves. I don't know that you can do that now if you're a 25-year-old, 26, and this leads into our discussion: housing, affordability.
Yeah.
How do we get that back into the Canadian the discussion? How can we fix that?
Well, look, it is in the Canadian discussion.
Mhm.
Although, one of the dangers of one of the negative things of the Trump influence is that a lot of our discussion is on defense and security and
Yeah.
U.S. tariffs, and we're now spending less time than we were a year ago talking about things like housing. We're not ignoring the issue, but we're not as focused on it as we could be in a world without the Trump type threats. Look, I think housing is something that we as a country have monumentally screwed up on over the past 20-ish years. And it's a complicated file. It's a complicated issue. I don't think you can just blame the feds or just blame the provinces or just blame the cities. I think there's a lot of blame to go around. I think you can blame the feds, for example, for big increases in immigration because every new immigrant to Canada requires some place to live, but only a small fraction of immigrants actually are involved in building houses. So in a world where demand was outpacing supply, immigration, I think, was an unfortunate thing to add into the mix. So you can, I think, blame the feds for that. I suppose you could blame the feds for having low interest rates for a long time, but I'm not sure I would, because those low interest rates, first driven by the financial crisis,
Yeah, there are
2008,
reasons.
I think those were a very important policy response and a
Yeah.
valuable policy response, but an unfortunate side effect of having those low interest rates in place for a long time, which I do believe was a necessary response to the financial crisis, was that, you were making home purchases a more attractive thing. Okay. I think you can blame the feds for introducing policies to assist first-time home buyers, but you could also understand why they did it, right? That's a classic example. So if you have a policy that assists first-time home buyers, that's actually adding to the demand for housing. So it's actually adding fuel to the fire. But it's one of those examples where the policy makes sense at a micro level. You're helping young people buy a house, but you're actually, in the macro sense, you're adding to the problem. But I think you can also blame municipalities. Municipalities are the ones that are, mostly in charge of their zoning restrictions. And NIMBYism, I think, is a
Yeah.
powerful force here. I live in Beaconsfield on the West Island of Montreal, and I can assure you that if somebody tried to build a, 4-story, 57-unit, condo complex 3 blocks from my house, there would be an outcry, not from
Right.
me, but there's all kinds of people that would say, not in my backyard,
Yeah. I
right?
want to keep my housing price, my value up.
And the town of, the city of Beaconsfield has no particular incentive to change the look and feel of their neighborhood, right? So you can imagine people voting to say, well, it's not our job to solve the housing problem. So you can blame municipalities for quite restrictive housing zoning restrictions across the country. And then, of course, you can blame provinces, I suppose, for not jumping in to override those municipal zoning restrictions, which they're now starting to do, right? So you've now seen the BC government pass laws that say, well, hold on now, you might have your zoning restrictions, but we're going to override those, and we're now going to pass a law that says every municipality in our province must allow 4 units on a lot or 6 units on a lot. So you're starting to see that. We're very much at the beginning of that. We could also talk about whether we have enough slots in our colleges to produce people for the building trades. Right. So that's a provincial thing. So, or do we have enough money going into that? Do we have enough capacity to produce the building trades that we need? Mark Carney talks about doubling housing starts. Housing starts are, bouncing around about 250,000 units per year. Yeah. And to achieve what he wants to achieve, we've got to get to about 500,000 or a little higher. Well, that requires zoning restrictions to change. It requires supplies to more or less double. It requires numbers of bodies that are trained plumbers, framers, electricians, et cetera, to more or less double. Even if we have productivity improvements coming from modular homes and prefab homes, which I think is actually a great idea on paper, but you're still talking about huge increases in resources. Can we do that? I don't know. I don't know how we do that. And house prices have increased so much faster. Average house prices have increased so much faster than average incomes. Just to put a number on it, for the first 20 years of this century, house prices increased on average by about 325%. Income, this is in nominal terms, incomes increased on average by about 95%. Okay? So if houses were affordable in 2000, well, they were way less affordable on average 20 years later because house prices increased 3 times faster than incomes. So, and just to finish it off.
Problem, isn't it?
Well, so to finish this off, though, and shortly after the election, somebody asked the new housing minister, Gregor Robertson, the former mayor of Vancouver, so do house prices have to decline? And he, I think he stumbled on that question and answer. Well, house prices don't have to decline, but it's some combination of house prices declining or incomes rising or both.
Yeah.
And it's not very easy, back to our first discussion about productivity, right? It's not so easy to just make incomes grow twice as fast. That'd be great if you could. But somewhere along the line, probably we want house prices to decline, but there's a huge political pushback for that, because house prices declining mean that anybody that has purchased a house in recent years is going to then be in a negative equity position. Right. So this is I really do think as a country we screwed up, but it's very important to know that it wasn't just any one government's fault. It was this collection of things that came together, and I think nobody was really watching it carefully enough until it got to the point like 2016, 2017, 2018. That's when we started talking about it. And then COVID really provided a blast as well. But I guess we should have had our eye on this ball, 10 years earlier.
Yeah. Well, that's been a common theme over the first couple of topics that we've been discussing is these problems, there's like the frog in boiling water. I mean, you put it in warm water and you heat it up, it doesn't even notice till it's in a crisis and we seem to have a number of these occurring at the same time that probably should have been addressed earlier.
Well, and when Justin Trudeau was asked about housing, I remember it must have been something like 2021 or 2022, I think he was asked about housing, and his response was, "It's not our jurisdiction." Well, he's right. Yeah. Right. I mean, he's right. Housing isn't a federal thing. But it's, it might not be the federal jurisdiction, but that doesn't make it not a federal problem. Yeah. And I think the problem is it's a federal problem, it's a provincial problem, it's a municipal problem, it's all of our problem, right? And we've got to figure it out.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of the topics that attach to Canadian economic, you know, development have at their core this sort of fight between federal and disagreements between federal and provincial governments and municipal sometimes. And one of the areas obviously where this is pretty obvious is resource development. All right. I'm moving into like our kind of third area topic. Clearly,
Yeah.
obviously, Canada is a major producer of oil and gas and resources across the board. They're among our most productive industries. Yet we're also trying, and I know this harkens back to your work on the Fiscal Commission. What's going on in that file? How do we do all these economic things that make us more competitive economically, but also pursue some things that people care about on the cleaner economy agenda? That in the United States, we see what Mr. Trump's done. I don't think he's worried about it at all, but we do. And there's a significant chunk of the American populace that does. But how do we manage that?
So I think so it's really hard to think about climate policy without also thinking about resource development, and I
Right.
would argue vice versa as well, right? And I think as a country, we haven't done well thinking logically and coherently about how these two things go together. So here's the way I like to think about sort of two solitudes in Canada, right? I mean, back in the day, we thought about two solitudes in Quebec as the French and the English. But let me think about climate policy and resource development, not just oil and gas, but oil and gas is an important part of that, as another two solitudes in Canada. So there's the one solitude that is, I would say, disproportionately in Ontario and Quebec and BC. The one solitude is, climate policy dominant.
Right.
And that view says, look, we've got to take climate seriously. We've got to do more on climate. We've got to have, active, aggressive policies designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Could be carbon pricing. Carbon pricing could be at the heart of it, but it could be carbon pricing plus other policies. But, we've got to do that. And an associated part of that mindset is that we've got to slow down our oil and gas development. In fact, the extreme view is we've got to phase out oil and gas. In fact, the more extreme view is we've got to just stop it cold turkey. Okay, there's all kinds of people within 100 meters of my office at McGill University who think it is immoral to continue producing oil and gas, and it is immoral to build pipelines. There are people who, I think it's pretty clear that in the 2019 election, the Liberals, who won a minority government, lost a bunch of seats in Quebec, probably because they had purchased the TMX pipeline. Okay. And that was just viewed as, how can a government that says it takes climate seriously, buy a pipeline? Okay, so there's that one solitude.
It's very solid. Like I want people to realize how important that issue is to parts of the country. They will endure the economic cost of perhaps shutting down oil and gas for this.
Well, yes, but I would argue that they don't even know about the economic cost.
Probably not.
And in many cases, they probably don't care. Okay. It's almost as if it's a moral position. It's not an economic position. So that's the one solitude. Very aggressive climate policy, and let's shut down oil and gas. Okay. Then there's the other solitude, which is disproportionately located in Alberta and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador. Right. So this is the heart of the oil and gas sector. 80% roughly of that is in Alberta. So that solitude says, look, climate policy is a threat to our existence. And, we produce oil and gas. We produce a lot of income coming from oil and gas. We export it to a world that needs it. So Canada is currently producing something like 5 million barrels of oil a day and exporting, 80% of it. And so they view climate policy as a threat, as an existential threat to their to their livelihoods. And they think it's kind of crazy, right? It's crazy that we should be doing this. We should be producing more oil and gas because the world needs it. So I think both of these solitudes they have correct elements, but they also have incorrect elements. I actually think you can argue, and I have long argued, that we should have aggressive and well-designed climate policy in this country. And I think a carbon price is a great part of that, whether it's a consumer-facing carbon price that now has been terminated in Canada, or whether it's the industrial carbon price, which is still around and I hope will still survive. But I think carbon pricing and even other policies, but I think carbon pricing is probably the single best policy to reduce emissions. I think we should have well-designed, aggressive climate policies in this country. But they are designed to really reduce our use of fossil fuels, not really designed to reduce our production of fossil fuels. So I can believe, and I do believe, in the need for aggressive, well-designed climate policies, at the same time that I agree that we should continue producing oil and gas. Because our production of oil and gas is, for the most part, aimed at a world, not Canada, aimed at a world that wants to use our oil and gas. And my view is, as long as the world continues to want oil and gas, Alberta and Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador should be kind of given the chance to sell their oil and gas to the world that wants it. Now, these two things do connect, right? But I do think conceptually we ought to be thinking about Canadian climate policy as really aimed at the users of fossil fuels in Canada, and oil and gas development, and for that matter, critical mineral development in Canada, aimed at the producers of those resources, most of which are aimed at users, purchasers, in the rest of the world. We can have climate policy in this country that's well-designed and aggressive, and we can promote oil and gas and critical mineral development and exports. Those two things completely are coherent, even though the people in the first solitude think it's incoherent to be promoting oil and gas while we're, promoting carbon pricing. I think that is completely false. These two things connect, because the production of oil and gas also does produce emissions. And so that's why it's important to have the oil and gas producers also facing an industrial carbon price. So they have incentives to actually change the way they produce. But when they produce that oil and gas in a less emissions intensive way, because they face that industrial carbon price, they're then exporting those things to the world. Now, the world probably will make a transition away from fossil fuels over the next 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years. They probably will. And when the world makes that transition and they demand less fossil fuels, they will over time demand fewer fossil fuels from Canada, and fine. So the Canadian fossil fuel industry may, through good old market forces, may phase out. But I think it would be crazy if we as a government in a country introduced policies that were intentionally designed to phase out oil and gas. So I wrote a paper with Mark Jackard and from SFU and Paul Rochon, former Deputy Minister of Finance, about the excessive cost of phasing out Canadian oil and gas. This is a crazy idea, to have a resource in the ground that the world wants, and then to take policies designed to phase out production. And this is why I have been against the emissions cap, the proposed emissions cap for the oil and gas sector, because that the danger of a not very well designed emissions cap is that it ends up acting like a policy that phases out production. And this is in fact exactly what what Danielle Smith and others will say. They'll say, well, this is an emissions cap, but it's going to act like a production cap, and that's going to choke back a lot of income. Again, those first solitude in Ontario and Quebec, they kind of like this idea. But the second solitude don't like this idea at all. So this is very politically divisive. So anyway, that's my take on these two things. I think we should be designing aggressive, well-designed climate policies like a carbon price. And I am sorry that the consumer-facing carbon price was eliminated. That I think is very unfortunate. And I hope the industrial carbon price is maintained and in fact improved. But at the same time, I am 100% in favor of, allowing or even encouraging the further development of oil, gas, critical minerals, whatever. If the world wants that stuff, as long as we can produce it in a locally, environmentally responsible way. So you don't want pipelines that are leaking, right? You don't want production methods that are highly damaging. But that's a different issue than the associated emissions. So I think those two things do go together. And I think the Canadian government actually, despite the fact that they bought TMX, the federal government has not done a good job I would say, over most of the Trudeau years in explaining that, to the first solitude, you got to say, no, you shouldn't be phasing out oil and gas. Yes, we can have climate policy, but we shouldn't be phasing out oil and gas. Nor have they explained well to the second solitude that, look, climate policy isn't a threat to you guys, right? You can have climate policy and you can develop oil and gas, and those two things go completely coherently together.
How much farther ahead on the regulatory and environmental front can we be over the United States without having massive amount of just capital just going all south? And I guess this is true in a number of areas of Canadian economic policy. The economic incentives in the United States seem to be more powerful for the economic point of view. How much differentiation can we have either on environmental policy or on a range of competitiveness policies without just watching our competitiveness slide even further to a more free-riding America? Or not free-riding, open America?
I think this is a great question. Look, financial capital is mobile. There's no question. Yeah. I mean, it may not be perfectly instantly mobile, but it is highly mobile. And it is going to flow to where the risk-adjusted returns are. So we absolutely have to think about, do changes to the Americans' tax system, what do those do? Changes in America's regulatory system, what does that do? This is not an argument for following everything that the US does, or the EU for that matter, right? I mean, financial capital doesn't just flow between Canada and the United States, it flows in all kinds of directions. You do have to think about what other countries are doing, and in particular the United States. That doesn't mean there has to be a race to the bottom, okay? So, but what it means is you've got to think carefully about how we design our tax system and how we design our regulatory system. If you're going to have a regulation that is an obstacle to investment in this country, we better be convinced that that obstacle is worth it. So, and I'm all in favor of regulations that are for health and safety reasons, regulations that are for environmental protection, regulations that are for human rights. There's all kinds of regulations that we have, I think, for very, very good reasons. And in those cases, what we should be saying to ourselves is, well, hold on, we're prepared to lose some investment because in this case, we're protecting some human rights, and that's valuable. And over here, we're prepared to lose some investment because we're protecting the environment, and that's valuable, okay? But at the same time, we should be saying, look, if our regulations are much more onerous than they are in the United States or in the EU, then let's make sure that we are getting something for the investment we're losing, right? And it ought to force us to look through those regulations and say, is this regulation really necessary? And are we really getting something good for that regulatory obstacle? Because it is an obstacle to investment. So
Right.
this is not an argument for a race to the bottom and just matching anything that happens in the United States. But it is an argument for saying, let's actually be a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more mindful about what we really need to protect the environment or to protect human rights or to protect labor standards or to protect whatever. Let's really make sure we're getting some benefits. Back to your earlier comment about competition and the banking sector. Well, we don't have a lot of competition in the banking sector. The six big bank CEOs will tell you it's a dog eat dog world, right? And there is rivalry. Of course, there's rivalry between
Yes.
BMO and TD, but come on.
Yeah.
It is pretty hard to believe that we have got anything like a competitive banking sector. I don't know if you've read Andrew Spence's book called Fleeced, which is a wonderful
No.
short book. It's like 100 pages. It's a Sutherland House book, published, I think, early this year or maybe late last year. It's called Fleeced, Fleeced. And the subtitle is something like, why Canadians hate their banks or something like that. But it is a book about the Canadian banking sector and how tight an oligopoly it is and how unrisk-taking they are and how overweight on Canadian mortgages they are and how very little lending they do to Canadian small businesses. And, Andrew Spence, I mean, he's kind of got this sardonic attitude and look on life that I quite like. But it's kind of hard to walk away from reading that book and say, oh, yeah, our banking sector is as good as it needs to be, right?
Mhm.
Well, some of that, what he would argue is poor performance in the banking sector, is the result of regulations. We've got foreign ownership restrictions, we've got other things. And a lot of Canadians say, oh, yes, but we need our nice, stable, well-regulated banking system. Well, not all. I mean, you could open up our banking system to more foreign banks and still have capital ratios and
Yeah.
still have regulations that ensure prudent banking, right? You don't have to undo all aspects of a good regulatory system to have more competition. So I think we need to do more of that. And you could talk about whether it's railways or airlines or the telecom sector or whatever. There's a book that was the second Max Bell Lectures last year by Vas Bednar and Denise Hearn called The Big Fix. And it's about the lack of competition in the Canadian economy. And it's not just those obvious ones like grocery stores and telecoms and banks. They talk about how there's a lot of lack of competition in sectors in Canada that we don't really think about that much.
No. Well, one of the things I know talking to some of my friends in the oil and gas industry, they don't like what they call the pancake layering of regulation. Like you've got municipal and you've got provincial and now you've got federal. And because of that, it takes forever. The regulatory outcome is uncertain, and therefore that's scaring away capital. Now, on the initial take of Bill C5, which you mentioned a little earlier, is that going to fix some of that? Or are we going to get a more efficient process out of this?
Well, so look, this is not my specialty, and I think it's also so I don't know, and I think we're actually too
Yeah,
probably
pretty young
soon in
yet.
this process for anybody to know,
Yeah,
because what C5 does, as I understand it, is it allows cabinet to say this project is in the national interest. Okay, so it'd be interesting to know like how they come to that decision, right? But
yeah,
once they've identified some project as being in the national interest, then they can override some existing laws that would otherwise put up obstacles. But it's not clear to me yet what that really means. Like, and if they, if they just say, well, this particular environmental law or this particular
yeah.
whatever law, you don't need to follow that. Well, then what is the regulatory process? So I don't know. I certainly don't know how that's going to work. And I don't know if anybody knows yet how that's going to work.
Right.
And my guess is we're going to wait and see until cabinet identifies project number one, and then we're going to see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's also when we'll learn, okay, to what extent, are, for example, Indigenous groups going to be consulted, and do they have a veto? And, how's that all going to work? Because at this point, I think Mark Carney is being probably appropriately ambiguous about what all of this means, probably because that's number one. It's probably more politically sensible to be ambiguous at this point, but also probably because he doesn't know how this is going to work out yet. Because I don't think it's going to be, I think it's going to be figured out as we go.
Yeah. The devil will be in the details of those projects. Last question, second to last question coming up. But one of the things I'd like you to do a little bit later is talk about, what your evaluation of the initial steps of the federal Liberal government on their long-term policy priorities. But before we get to that, there's one more big elephant in the room that most of us try to ignore as much as possible. Canadians owe a lot of money. There's a lot of debt, as do Americans. There's a lot of public sector debt, and it seems to be going up, particularly in the United States. They just passed the big, beautiful bill that's going to add trillions of dollars to the U.S. debt. And we are running deficits habitually here as well, at least federally. Can you talk a little bit about where that came from and the implications of that large amount of debt being held out there by governments?
So when you said Canadians owe a lot of money, the first thing you want to do is make the distinction between private debt and government debt.
Well, I'm talking about government at the moment.
Yeah. So I will speak more about government debt, but it's useful to also keep in mind that Canadians owe a lot of money privately, right?
Yes.
Now, some of them also have a lot of wealth in those houses whose prices have gone up.
Yeah.
And so their balance sheets look good until and unless maybe those house prices decline, if they do decline. Okay. So private debt is one issue, but public debt is something that I am more concerned about. Now, just to take back your audience members back to the 1990s. Some of them will be old enough to remember it, and some of them will not. But Canada, the Canadian government and provincial governments of Canada hit the debt wall in 1994, 1995. Our debt to GDP ratio, federal plus provincial debt as a share of GDP, was about 90%, a little higher. So there was at that time, beginning with the 95 federal budget, there was a very substantial fiscal consolidation. If you look at the data, you'll see that federal spending as a share of GDP fell by about 7 percentage points of GDP, 7 percentage points from the mid-1990s to the early 2000s. That's a huge change. Tax revenues also fell, but much, much less. Most of the action was on the cuts in spending. And a lot of that was transfers to provinces. So this fiscal consolidation was downloaded to the provinces. The provinces then had to make some very tough decisions about healthcare and education and other things. But what we did is we converted very large budget deficits in the mid-1990s into budget surpluses, budget balance, and then budget surpluses by the early 2000s. And our debt to GDP ratio, the federal debt to GDP ratio, by the beginning of the financial crisis in 2008, had fallen to 30%. It had gone from 68 or 70% of GDP to 30%. Okay, that is shocking. So in 1993, 4, 5, Canada was viewed as the fiscal profligate, fiscal bad boy of the G7. And by the early 2000s, Canada was the poster child for fiscal responsibility. And that all happened in 6 or 7 years. It's really quite remarkable. Okay. So here we get to the financial crisis. The debt to GDP ratio is about 30%. Stephen Harper as Prime Minister, Jim Flaherty as Finance Minister, they embark on a classic Keynesian fiscal stimulus package. They didn't much like doing this, but they did it. And this is when I was the Clifford Clark visiting economist at the Department of Finance. So I lived through that 2009 and 2010 budget, which were classic Keynesian, counter-cyclical fiscal stimulus budgets. And as I said, they didn't really like doing this, but they realized the need to do it. And our debt to GDP ratio went up a few percentage points, but then it came back down as the economy recovered and they tightened up fiscal policy. And so then we come along to the beginning of COVID. And at the very beginning of COVID, the federal debt to GDP ratio was back down to about 30%. Maybe it was 31%. And then with COVID, it just blew out, right? So COVID was a huge, huge, huge shock to the economy. It was a huge shock to government spending. And the federal government proved very, very quickly that they were, even if they were not good at many things, the one thing the federal government could show that it was very good at was getting money out the door at scale quickly to people who needed it. Through the CERB and through other benefits, some of which flowed to individuals, some of which flowed to businesses. And so what we had was, the deficit went up by something like 18 percentage points, federal plus provincial, 18 percentage points of GDP, okay, during COVID, and then came back down, okay? And so now what you've got is federal debt is about 45% of GDP, okay? Remember, it was 30 both before before and after the financial crisis. It was 30 before COVID. Now it's 45, okay? That's federal. And then you add in the provinces, well, that's about another 30, 35%. So now you've got the federal plus provincial at 75 to 80. Now let's remember, back in 1995, when we hit the debt wall, federal plus provincial was a little over 90. So we're not there yet, but we're getting there. Yeah. And under the last 5 years of the Trudeau government, they kept saying that the debt to GDP ratio would decline, but then every year it bumped up, bumped up, bumped up. So now where are we? So we're at 45 now federally-ish, plus another 30 or 35 provincially. And we've got a federal government that claims to be fiscally responsible. It claims to want to get the operating budget to balance, but it's quite prepared to borrow for investment things.
Right.
But it's also said that it's going to increase spending on defense by something like 3 percentage points, maybe a little bit more, right? We're going from less than 2 percentage points of GDP up to 5, but some of that is probably double counting, but we're certainly increasing by a few percentage points. And the one thing we really haven't seen yet from the Carney government is how is he going to pay for it all? Now, he has announced that he wants ministers to look for cuts in their departments, 7.5% of their spending by next year, 10% the following year, etc. But that is not big enough to, even if it happens, even if that happens, to those amounts, that's not big enough to pay for even just the defense spending. So what we don't yet have from the Carney government is the plan. And, I understand why he may not want to talk about that, because nobody wants to talk about, well, will we increase some taxes? If taxes, which ones? Or will we, increase the debt to GDP ratio more and more? And he doesn't really want to talk about that. Or will we really cut spending more seriously than what we've just announced? And if so, on what things? Because he said, well, we're not going to cut transfers to provinces for healthcare, and we're not going to cut OAS. Well, there's kind of only a few choices. So you either cut some spending, or you raise some taxes, or you run bigger budget deficits. And I understand why none of those are, politically sound very good, but those are the only 3 choices. And so what I worry about here, David, is that we just let the debt to GDP ratio creep up and creep up. Now, I don't think we are in the situation of Greece in 2011, right? Where we're not yet at the situation. I don't even think we're close to the situation where the capital markets, those institutions and individuals that own government bonds, I don't think they're going to wake up tomorrow morning and go, oh my God, let's stop buying Canadian government bonds. But they did in 1995, and they could again, in our near future if we are not careful. And so what I would like to see, what I would urge the Canadian government to do is to talk about this and to say, we want to make sure. I would love to hear Mark Carney say, we will not get close to where we were in 1995. We will stay far away from that debt wall, because once the capital markets, the bondholders wake up and say, we no longer want to buy your bonds, that's kind of too late. You don't want that to happen. You want to be far away from that. And what that means is you have to have policies in place, I think, and a very clear plan in place, visibly in place, so that bond markets know that there is a fiscal plan that will keep you far away from that debt wall.
Well,
I don't think we're close to the debt wall, but we just keep moving up.
Yeah.
I don't see a plan in place to prevent us from going further.
One of the worries I have is this contagion effect potentially about the Americans, if they keep running deficits. We aren't them. It appears that people will be willing to lend money to the United States pretty much no matter what they do. But we are not that. And I worry about if they ever stop it. Yeah.
So I agree that we are not, historically, we are not viewed as the safe asset, and the U.S. Treasuries are. But recently, this is a problem, is that recently the bond markets have been backing up in the United States because even the U.S. bonds are not viewed as the safe asset that they used to be. So does that help us or hurt us? I don't think it helps us, okay? I don't think our argument should be, oh, we're not going to worry about our debt to GDP ratio because we're a safer asset than the U.S.
Better than they are.
I don't want to use that argument. I mean, maybe that's going to end up being true, but I don't think we have an end to the U.S. fiscal exceptionalism just yet. So the fact that the U.S. is I think, moving in the wrong direction does not make me feel more comfortable about our debt to GDP ratio currently being below the US. And in net terms, here's another thing to keep in mind. Net terms, we are in much better shape than the US.
Right.
But gross is not so different. Okay. Now, I actually think net debt ratio is a better measure. But you're going to service if you're going to service all your debt, you're going to service the gross debt, not just the net debt.
Right.
Americans don't like to talk about net debt because they don't have accumulated assets in their Social Security fund to the extent that we have. So we like to talk about net debt because we've got things like the QPP and the CPP assets that they don't have. So they like to talk gross. We like to talk net. And keep that difference in mind. But I am just uncomfortable by the complacency that to me is, and I think the previous government and Chrystia Freeland as finance minister displayed this complacency. It was, oh, no worry, interest rates are low and our debt to GDP ratio is lower than any place in the G7. Well, that's true, but interest rates then went up rather quickly, and our debt ratio continues to rise. So I want us to be less complacent and a little bit more prudent. This is not an argument for fiscal austerity. This is an argument really for taking fiscal prudence seriously.
Right. Well, that's, I remember reading George Will. One of the problems that in modern democracies is people want $1 worth of government. They only want to pay 75 cents. But you need to either pay the dollar or only get 75 cents. These are the real choices that have to be made. Just to wrap this up, you've already had an extensive career in academia, but you've also had an extensive public service, participation career and done lots of things. If you were having a conversation with Mr. Carney so far and his economic advisors and the rest, what would you tell them about you've talked about a lot of things already that you think really matter, our debt management, our ability to do with climate policy and export resources. So there's a lot you've already covered. Is there anything else you'd like to say to them that you haven't told us yet?
Well, that last part on debt and having taking those fiscal options seriously, I think is if I only had a limited 10 minutes or something, I think I'd focus on that. Look, he is caring about the right things, right? He's obviously caring about our trading relationship with the United States and how to make a deal. And I don't even know what a deal means with Donald Trump these days. But his heart and mind is in the right place on that issue. He clearly cares about our housing issue, and he takes seriously the supply issue, and he takes seriously the need for social housing. I never used to be a big believer in social housing, but the unaffordability of housing is not just an issue anymore for the bottom 5% of the income distribution.
No.
Right? This is a problem now for people in the middle of the income distribution. And if kind of normal people can't afford houses, we've got ourselves a serious problem. And so his plan to build more homes through Canada Build Homes, is that what it's called? Setting up that Crown corporation that will actually lend money to developers to use modular homes and prefab. I think that's a great idea. Now, whether it works or not, whether he can do it at scale, whether he can do it quickly enough, I don't know. But I actually think that reveals that he's thinking correctly about the problem. I think he's thinking correctly about the need for the country to be able to invest in big projects. So I think Bill C5 makes some sense. And how he's going to do it is another matter. So I think Mark Carney is thinking about all the right problems, and he absolutely is a man in a hurry, and I think that's good, right? Yeah. I think for too long, our federal government really hasn't taken economics seriously. They just haven't been interested, or I would argue very competent on that front. And I think I think the Carney government is taking it very seriously, and Mark Carney plus Michael Sabia are nothing if not super competent. So I think all of that is good. Their hearts, their minds, their actions are in the right places. But Mark Carney has set expectations super high for himself. Now, I think that's a very Mark Carney thing to do, right? I mean, I've known Mark, ever since he was a brand new deputy governor at the bank and I was special advisor to David Dodge. That's when I met Mark Carney. And he is that guy. He likes to set expectations high for himself, and then he likes to deliver. Well, okay. I mean, I hope he can deliver on all of these things. I hope we can double the rate of housing construction. I hope we can get projects done. I hope we can become an energy superpower and produce, more oil and gas, but also more clean power and export it to the world. I hope we can, improve our industrial carbon pricing. I hope we can improve our GDP per capita. I hope we can increase our trade connections with the rest of the world. I hope we can make a pro-trade agreement with the United States. I want all of those things. So I am rooting for Mark Carney. Absolutely. Whether he can accomplish all those things is another matter. But Michael Sabia is also a force to be reckoned with. And so as the clerk, he's going to be interesting. And the two of these guys together, I mean, I hope they get along because they are both type A personalities. And like they both tend to be the smartest guy in the room. And so when they're in a room together, like who's going to be the smartest guy? I don't know. Because they're both very impressive, very ambitious, very driven people. And so if they can be in sync, man, the world just might change.
It's interesting you ended with that. The personality issues at the top of when decisions are made are actually have a huge impact on what actually gets done. Sometimes people forget about that these are real people involved with real views on how they think should work. And if they work together, all things are possible. But if they don't, little is possible. So that's a great way to kind of wrap this up.
Well,
Any final
I
comments? Yeah.
have to believe when Mark Carney asked Michael Sabia to be clerk.
He had to
Um,
know that about him. He had to know what he was getting.
well, yeah, I mean, presumably they knew each other, right?
Yeah, I would
And
assume.
presumably they knew not just knew each other, but knew each other in terms of personality. And, so they got to figure out their division of duties.
Mhm.
Mark Carney is the prime minister, so he is the one that is setting the policy direction. Michael Sabia, as the clerk, has got to be setting sort of this is how the government will achieve this. This is the implementation path. And if they can, man, if they can kind of divide their duties and stick to their comparative advantages there, and man, they just may be unstoppable.
We can only hope. We can hope. I think, yeah. And last question, just to wrap this up. I mean, you had a heck of a career, and again, a lot of these students, a lot of the people watching this will be students who are embarking on theirs. I don't know if you have any advice on the economics profession as a potential career, or just generally speaking, if you'd want to share with them, here's your chance. So I'd be interested to hear what you had to say.
Well, I'm not sure I have any brilliant advice. Look, um, I did what I did, the various things, because I loved economics.
Yeah.
I loved learning economics. I then loved teaching economics. I loved writing about economics. I loved getting into, learning more about the design of economic policy. And this is why I loved spending my time. I spent two different one-year periods at the Bank of Canada, which were fabulous. I spent 18 months at the Department of Finance, which was super fabulous. Those things were literally life-changing, brain-changing experiences for me. I could not return to McGill and kind of think the same way, teach the same way, write the same way. I just couldn't. You just, if you're, it's to me, it's inconceivable that you could spend a year at a government or at a central bank, and if you walk away unchanged, you must have just stayed in your office and been working on your own, right? If you're going to talk to people, it's going to change your life. It's going to change the way you think about policy. And so I just loved and I continue to love economics. And that's what I did. I kind of took the path of what path allows me to keep loving economics and doing stuff that I love. And I think economics is just a fabulous, fabulous discipline. It's got its challenges, it's got its problems, but I don't know how people make sense of 50% of what's in their newspaper on a daily basis without a basic sense of economics. And so, I think academia is fabulous. Academia is fabulous because you can kind of teach what you want, you can work on what you want, but it's also fabulous because it gives you the flexibility to take a year off and go to the Bank of Canada, or take 18 months off and go to finance, or to write a book on the side. And academia also has its challenges, but if you love economics, you love policy, get someplace where you can do economics and do policy. And it doesn't have to be in academia. It could be in a think tank. It could be in the government. There's lots and lots of great people doing lots of great economic policy stuff in governments, federal, provincial, city governments. So all of that was a very rambly way to give you no great advice.
Well, there were some there. I mean, one of the things about economics, you and I both know Stephen Poloz, and he told me once the reason he got into economics because he saw it as a great tool to actually help people. And I think sometimes economics is thought of as being kind of an abstract field, and what you've just talked about, it's a way to make people's lives better if it's done right. And that's
It
not
sure
nothing.
is. Yeah, look, I've known Steve for a long time and I love him dearly. In fact, Steve Poloz is the guy who really got me into monetary policy. He invited me back in 1993, and I was not into monetary policy at that time. I was a macro guy, but I wasn't into monetary policy. He invited me to write a paper for their fall conference in 93, and the topic was something like inflation uncertainty or something in an inflation targeting world. And I said, well, geez, Steve, I don't know anything about that. And he goes, yeah, you're a smart guy. You'll figure it out. And so I wrote a paper, and then that turned into visiting at the Bank of Canada for Thursdays and Fridays for a year. And then that got into my first sabbatical being in the research department at the bank. So in fact, you can credit or blame Steve Poloz for my entry into monetary policy as a topic. But I credit him. But he absolutely does believe that economics is a force for good and a force for helping people, and I completely agree with that. I love talking to people, as a prof, talking to people and watching the light go off over their head when they understand some economic relationship that they had never understood before, or the way to think about the world that they had never really gotten before. And to me, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is pretty cool. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time. We've been at this, an hour and a half, and it went pretty quick, as they always do. I learned an enormous amount, and I'm sure the students will too. So thank you very much, Chris, for your time this afternoon on Friday afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day in Manitoba.